Welcome to the Unfettered Speech Podcast. I'm Patrick Sullivan.
And I'm Leonard Goodman. And we have a very special guest today, so let's get right to it. If that's all right, Pat. We have Ali Abunimah, who is the editor and founder of Electronic Intifada, which is also based in Chicago. Ali is coming to us from the country of Jordan. So welcome, Ali. Thank you for taking the time.
Hi, Len.
And
Hi, Patrick. It's my
You're
pleasure.
welcome, Ali. Thank you for joining us.
well, let's start with since you're in the area, let's start with the situation in the West Bank. And by the way, I should mention that the Electronic Intifada is probably the best source of information on Palestine, Gaza, the West Bank. Fantastic source. So let me just let's start by talking about the West Bank since you're right in that neighborhood, Ali. According from your site, you reported a report from the UN High Commissioner stating Israeli settlers are roaming free with complete impunity, often armed, forcing Palestinian families after family off their lands. As a result, at least 9 communities have been fully or partially displaced since February 28th, mostly on the northern Jordan Valley. Can you give us an update on what is the situation in the West Bank?
Yeah, those examples you gave, you will find all over the West Bank. The broad picture is that there has been an intensified campaign of ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. It's accelerated since October 7th, 2023. And were the genocide in Gaza not the enormous historic crime that it is, the West Bank would be a major world news story, but because of the scale of what has happened in Gaza and everything else going on in the region, what's happening in the West Bank has, to a certain extent, escaped notice, and the Israelis know that. So there is this intensification of land theft, ethnic cleansing, and it's done, of course, ultimately by the Israeli state, but the mechanism is that the foot soldiers of this ethnic cleansing campaign are the religious settlers, and they are carrying out literal pogroms in Palestinian towns and villages almost every night, burning houses, burning cars, shooting and injuring and killing Palestinians. This is happening across the West Bank. And my family, my father's family, is from the West Bank. And so even though I haven't been in a few years, we hear all the time about the settler encroachments, the notices that suddenly appear on people's land from the army saying this land is now off limits to you, it's state land, or the army has restricted it. So there is this whole administrative apparatus of land theft that is accelerating because the Israeli state and the settlers are determined to formally or officially annex the West Bank, and they're trying to create the conditions for that, of them controlling all the land and there being no Palestinians on it.
Ali, go ahead, Pat.
I would just want to ask some background, Ali, because you're so familiar with the area, and many people are. But a lot of people have been brought to this issue over the past couple of years, and probably haven't focused on it to the extent that you have. So, can you give us a little background there? For instance, I know that the West Bank was not part of the original Israel that was part of the UN orders in 1950, in the 1950s when Israel was created. But who owns the West Bank now? How big is it? How many people live there? Presumably they've been living there for thousands of years. But how, just the little background of what it is, and then also while you're at it, who are these settlers? I've heard they're Americans, but where are they coming from? Why are they so incentivized to commit these crimes? And then how is it you talked about the process of land theft, but how is it then memorialized? So if if a person were a settler and they threw out somebody, how then do they get deed to the land? I mean, how does that actually work in law? So all those background questions would be helpful, I think,
Those are
for
those are really good questions. And I'll start with the last one, which is that it is a lawless process. The settlers have there is a long history, well documented, of fictitious land sales where they will just show up with fake documents claiming that they purchased the land from some person who owns it. The other thing is that the Israelis, and this goes back to the history, before the state of Israel existed, this area was under British occupation, and then before that, it was under Ottoman occupation. So they will go back and find laws going back to Ottoman times that they will claim allow them to take the land. And Palestinian society is a traditional society, a traditional rural society where land was held in common by villages, by large families. It was not held in the form of individual title and deed. And so what the Israelis do is they say, well, if you can't show us an individual title, then you don't own that land. But that was never how land was traditionally held. And they will also say that if you don't have a deed going back to Ottoman times, then you can't prove that you own the land. So when the British were there, and this goes into, I won't go into a lot of detail about this, but the British tried to impose a system of individual land registration, but that was not for the benefit of Palestinians. It was the benefit of for the benefit of foreign settlers, so that they could buy land from individuals and then claim title to it. So it's a whole system of subterfuge, to the extent that they even bother with the pretense of land sales. In other cases, the Israeli army, the Israeli military government, and we've had this done to land that my family owns, rural land. We come from a rural village in the West Bank where they just put a sign on it and declare this is state land. The other thing they'll do is they again use these old archaic Ottoman laws that say if land is not cultivated for a certain period of time, then you lose title to it. But they also don't allow Palestinians to cultivate it. So they create these just cruel and Orwellian catch-22s where in the end they always win. Now, to go back to your question about just giving a very brief geography, the area of what we call historic Palestine is today what you call Israel, the West Bank and Gaza Strip. That's how they'll mostly appear. And 80 years ago, there was no such thing as the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. This was one country, Palestine. It had been part of the Ottoman Empire for many centuries, and Palestinians had lived there, Palestinian Muslims, Christians, and a small number of Palestinian Jews, and also a small number of foreign Jews who would come on pilgrimages, but they were not Zionists. They were not coming to form a state or for settlement. And in 1917, at the end of the First World War, the British Empire occupied the region, the British and the French, and the British took control of Palestine, and they ran Palestine for the next few decades. And during that period, the British supported the Zionist movement, which is a European Jewish nationalist colonial movement to colonize Palestine. And the British supported Zionism absolutely in word and in deed. And during that period, they enabled Zionist colonization and displacement of Palestinians, which led to increasing violence and strife and resistance. Palestinians resisted the theft of their land very fiercely. And then in 1948, the British decided to withdraw. The Zionists carried out an ethnic cleansing campaign and conquered most of Palestine, 78% of the country, except for two areas. One became known as the West Bank and the other became known as the Gaza Strip. These are not sort of administrative entities that existed before that. They're simply ceasefire lines. And in 1948, what we call the Nakba, when most of the Palestinian population was expelled into what became the West Bank, into what became Gaza, into Lebanon, into Jordan, into Syria. Israel was then established. The West Bank remained in the hands of Jordan, and the Gaza Strip remained in the hands of Egypt. And that was the situation and essentially until 1967, when Israel launched a war and conquered all of it. So since 1967, Israel has controlled the whole of historic Palestine, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the areas it conquered in 1948. And the distinction is that much of the world, not Palestinians necessarily, and not all countries, but you could say much of the world recognizes Israel on the land that it took in 1948, but not as having any legal claim to the West Bank or Gaza Strip. Those are considered occupied territories. So Israel controls them, but they're supposedly subject to the Fourth Geneva Convention, the laws that govern military occupation, which means Israel has no legal sovereignty, no entitlement. It is considered a war crime under international law to move settlers into the land or to expel the indigenous people and so on. And there's a lot of well-settled international law about that, but we can talk about how much any of that matters in this world of might makes right.
Ali, just to follow up on Pat's question about the settlers, it sounds like the situation is you have Palestinian people that are indigenous in some respect to the land, have been there for decades, if not centuries. And then you have people, Zionists kicking them out, who are not indigenous to the land. So that's my one question. Who are these settlers? Are they Americans? Are they fanatics? My understanding is that Israel basically likes these people to just sort of turn them loose in the West Bank because they don't really want them living amongst the Israelis because these people are nuts. Maybe you could enlighten us on that. And also, what is the police? Are all of the police collaborating with Israel? Obviously, you have the IDF soldiers that are protecting the settlers. Is there any Palestinian police force present in the West Bank?
Yeah, these are all really good questions. So, again, without giving a too lengthy history, but the Zionist movement was, as I said, a European Jewish nationalist movement that arose in the 19th century. And that's what a lot of people know. But what people don't recognize, which I think is incredibly important, is that before Zionism was a Jewish movement, it was a Christian fundamentalist movement. It was a Christian Protestant evangelical movement whose roots go back, really you can trace it to 17th century England, but certainly 18th century Europe. And it's rooted in European anti-Semitism. Now, if we take the example of Christianity, everybody knows, because everyone who's familiar with Christian belief or who goes to a Sunday school knows that the roots of Christianity are in Palestine. We know the story of Jesus being born in Bethlehem, of his Joseph and Mary coming from Nazareth to Bethlehem and so on, that this all takes place in the geography of Palestine. Everyone knows that. But nobody thinks, you don't find anybody really who thinks, I mean, maybe there's some kooks out there, but certainly no mainstream Christian thinks that all Christians have their genetic roots in Palestine. That, a Christian from Scotland or from Norway, that their ancestors migrated from Palestine to Norway or from Palestine to Scotland. Nobody thinks that. Everyone understands that Christianity spread through conversion, through people adopting this religion, or through sovereigns imposing it on their people, or however it came to pass. Now, the same is actually true, historically speaking, of Judaism. Judaism spread by conversion. There were different states or sovereigns or peoples that adopted Judaism, and that's how it spread. But the anti-Semitic European idea was to say that now Jews in Ukraine or Jews in Russia or Jews in Poland, their ancestors actually migrated from Palestine to Poland or Ukraine or Russia, which, if you think about it, is ridiculous. But that anti-Semitic idea served a purpose of enabling this anti-Jewish idea as the idea of Europe was being formed, that Jews are not part of Europe. They are Oriental and they belong somewhere else, and they should return there. And this got married to this Christian Protestant belief that Jews returning to Palestine is, quote unquote, returning to Palestine, is essential to the fulfillment of, the Revelation end times. So you had major Christian British politicians like Balfour and Lloyd George and others who had these Christian Protestant beliefs and supported Zionism for that reason. And so originally it was a Christian Protestant idea that was rejected by the vast majority of European Jews, including European Jewish rabbis and leaders and organized Jewry. That's well documented. Only later in the 20th century did it become more widespread against Jews, and particularly in the 40s. And once Israel was established, it became, in a sense, a dominant idea among Jewish communities around the world. But the reason I'm giving that history is to say that Zionism was principally, who were the first or the major influx of Zionist settlers into Palestine in the early decades of Zionism were from Russia, from Ukraine, from other parts of Europe. But Ukraine and Russia played a very big part in that. In latter decades, you see that there are not that many Jews who left who still want to come to Palestine, but the most fanatical and motivated elements today include Americans in particular. And you see that in some of the West Bank settlements. But so that's to give you an idea. Now, the Palestinians, the indigenous Palestinians who are Christian, Arab, and then a small number historically of Jews, were the peoples or the descendants of the peoples who included Jews, who included people who spoke Aramaic, who included people who converted from Judaism to Christianity, to Islam, who converted between different Christian traditions. For example, Palestinian Eastern Orthodox Christians, of whom there are still many, but many Palestinian Christians converted from Orthodoxy to Catholicism or to Anglicanism when, imperial, British, German, other missionaries came. So that's to give you a sense that the Jewish, to the extent that Palestine has a Jewish history, that is part of the history of the indigenous Palestinian people. And the idea that, these settlers from Ukraine or Russia or Brooklyn or wherever it might be are the true and only inhabitants of Palestine or heirs to Palestine would be like saying if you were to go to Boston and take all the people who are descended from, Irish immigrants who came in the 1850s, that they would have the right to go to Ireland today and to expel Irish people from their homes today and take their land, take their homes, and say, well, our forefathers came from here, so we have that right. Obviously, that doesn't make sense. In this case, it makes even less sense because those Ukrainians, those Russians, those Brooklynites, those whatever, don't even have any organic ancestral links to the land. They adopted, or their ancestors adopted, a religion that has some connection to the geography of Palestine, just like the Christian religion does. I hope I didn't go too far off on a tangent, but I think people don't often hear that.
No, the history lesson is great. I love it. It's great to just hear the background and how this all came about. What do you think the end game is here, Ali? Now that you see all these conflicts, it's 8 countries, I believe, where there's conflict with Israel. In your view, is the goal of all this? To create Lebensraum for other settlers to move in? Is that the idea, or why are they doing this now? Is it just to destabilize their neighbors in perpetuity? What do you
Well,
think they're working towards?
I mean, something Len said before I gave my long answer is about, these settlers, who are they within Israeli society? And I think, Len, there was a period in which the settlers we see carrying out the pogroms across the West Bank today were seen as fringe within Israeli society. That was probably true until the 1990s or the early 2000s, but that is not the case today. They are the government today. So people like Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is the so-called national security minister, and Bezalel Smotrich, who is the finance minister, and these are very senior figures in the government. They are pogromists. They are the people who were supporting and carrying out pogroms themselves with their own hands 20, 30 years ago. So there's been a total transformation in Israeli society where the fringe is now the center. And the most extreme form of Zionism is the mainstream. So what's their goal? Yes, it is Lebensraum. They have this idea and they talk openly. And we heard Mike Huckabee, the US ambassador in Israel, although you don't really know which country he represents, recently in that interview with Tucker Carlson, where he endorsed the idea of a greater Israel from the Nile River to the Euphrates. And you'll probably remember his words. He said, yeah, it would be fine if they take it all. And that is the view of the Israeli government, that they have the right to all that land. So Jordan has no right to exist. Lebanon has no right to exist. Right now, as almost 1 million people have been forced out of their homes in Lebanon, and more than 1,000 people killed in Israeli bombardments over the last 3 weeks, Bezalel Smotrich is saying we should annex the southern part of Lebanon up to the Litani River. So they're very open about that goal. And so that's their end game. And I think that we're now in kind of in a sense, I mean, I hate to sound dramatic, but it's hard not to when I literally have missiles flying over my head, the final battle, because the so-called moderate Arabs and the Arab states have tried for decades to find some accommodation with this Israel. Jordan, where I'm sitting, has a peace treaty. Egypt has a peace treaty. You had all the Gulf countries who, tacitly or openly had peace treaties. You had the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, signed the Oslo Accords with Israel in 1993 and essentially went from being a liberation movement to a collaborationist government under Israeli occupation. And that gets to Len's question about, are there Palestinian police and what can they do? Yes, there are Palestinian police who were created under the Oslo Accords with the Palestine Liberation Organization, but under the agreements that govern their role, they have no authority except over Palestinians. So it's literally in the agreements that if a settler pulls out a gun and shoots dead a Palestinian child in front of a Palestinian police officer, that police officer has no authority to arrest or lay hands on that settler. So it is kind of a native police force that has jurisdiction only over the physical bodies of the native people living in reservations, but no authority or jurisdiction over land whatsoever. So that's just an aside to my bigger point, which is that Arab states and the Palestinians have tried for decades to make some accommodation with Israel to no avail. Nothing is enough because this is a messianic Lebensraum movement, as you put it, Patrick, that is determined on expansion, expulsion, and complete and total control of all the land with none of the people. And they think that this is their moment, that this is it. It's now or never, because the U.S., I think they sense, as we all do, that the US empire is somehow unraveling. I don't want to say weakening because we can see the utter devastation it's capable of causing, but certainly unraveling, that its legitimacy is in retreat, and Israel's strength is tied to that. So I think they're in a hurry to kind of grab as much as they can, or at least do as much damage as they can to any other country that they think could pose any kind of challenge to them. And so that meant taking out Iraq, it meant taking out Syria, it meant taking out Libya, and now it means taking out Iran.
Ali, before we move on from your neighborhood, you're coming to us from Jordan. You talk about these peace treaties between Jordan and Israel, Egypt and Israel. What is the what do the people feel about these peace treaties? What is so my understanding is you have leadership that have made peace with Israel, and you sort of described the way that works on the ground in the West Bank, which is they basically have no jurisdiction over the hoodlums. So it's not working very well for the Palestinians. How's it working for the Jordanians? How's it working for the Egyptians? What is the feeling of the people in the street about their leaders?
Well, people are not always open about what they say in public because there are restrictions on what you can say. But the reason there are restrictions is because I would say that, and this wouldn't be an exaggeration, 99% of people are utterly horrified by these agreements. They don't support them. They don't want them. They view Israel as an enemy. That's not an irrational belief to them because they have watched not just everything Israel has done over the last 80 years, but in particular over the last almost 3 years, a genocide in Gaza. They view Israel to be a mortal enemy, as a threat to them. They believe, you hear this commonly, that when Israel is done with Iran, done with Syria, done with that we're next, that they covet the land of Jordan because they have maps that show Jordan as part of Eretz Israel, Greater Israel. And that's not an irrational belief when you consider that it was just a year ago that Trump's big idea was to expel the Palestinians to Jordan and Egypt. So people look at that and they say, what's the benefit of making a peace treaty with Israel or becoming essentially a vassal of the United States? It doesn't save you because the moment they're done with you, they turn on you and they will have no regard for you. And you hear this discourse now in the Gulf countries that you saw how much they have they literally danced for Donald Trump when he came to the Gulf. They danced for him. They showered him with riches. They said, we'll invest, however many trillions you want in the United States. They buy hundreds of billions of dollars of American weapons. They allow the U.S. to place bases all over the region. And the belief was this will protect us. The United States will protect us. Well, it turned out it was the United States and Israel who endangered them, who brought them war, who brought them missiles, and who, when it came to it, could not protect them. And people see that and they understand it and they don't support it. I don't go to any gathering in this country or anywhere else. I have to be, I guess, a little bit precise in what I say, where people are not well, let me put it this way, and you can take what you want from it. Nobody buys the official narratives, and their hearts and minds are where you would not be surprised they are with resistance and with states that support resistance.
And how does that play out in those countries? Because I remember in the 70s, 80s, the pushback from a lot of the Arab world was, well, the street won't, there was a phrase, the street won't let us do that. The street won't let us go that far. Whatever it was that it was on the table. Maybe it was the Bill Clinton agreements, but it was the street that was the hard pushback. And now, as you say, people must be horrified by all the things that are happening and must be aware that they could be next. But where's the street? What happened to that street?
Well,
And is there any
it's
chance
been
that they could?
effectively repressed. I mean, I have to, I'm sorry to say it. The sentiment is there, but it's there isn't there is there is significant political repression. Let me put it that way, and it's not the sentiment is not translated into effective political power at this point. I mean, the street, you could say the street, or what we might call the street, restrains some of the more sort of vulgar public displays of alliance with Israel, but it hasn't restrained a real practical military, strategic, and intelligence alliance. And so you have to wonder whether the bill will come due one day. I mean, we saw that in the so-called Arab Spring in 2011, where there were some popular uprisings, but a lot of it was quickly co-opted by the U.S. through its regime change, or I don't know, regime management arms, and redirected. It was redirected into the regime change war in Syria and Libya and so on. So this bill may come due, and this war could decide the future of how viable these regimes, which are many of them very dependent on U.S. support, how viable they remain.
Well, my recollection of the Arab Spring was that the Egyptians elected someone from the Muslim Brotherhood, and the powers that be threw him in prison, and I think he
Murdered
died
him.
in prison, and
Yeah.
replaced him with Sisi. So that let's talk about the resistance then. It seems like the resistance to this capitulation comes from Gaza, particularly, and from Iran. Let's start with Gaza. What is the situation there? I mean, those people have been through hell over the last 3 years, yet they're not willing to pack up and leave. They're going to stay, even though their homes are all destroyed. I mean, I've seen pictures of Gaza. We all have seen them. It's a parking lot. Yet they're not leaving. What is the situation there since February 28th, when people have sort of turned their attention away? Are there any of the crossings open? Is there food getting in? What is the situation?
The situation is extremely dire on a humanitarian level. We talk to our friends and colleagues in Gaza all the time, almost every day, and it is catastrophic. And people are suffering. And since February 28th, Israel has tightened the siege again. Very little of what people need, including medicine, food, and reconstruction supplies. Very little to none of that is getting in. And the genocide is continuing by, at a lower intensity. And just since, the so-called ceasefire in October, 667 Palestinians have been killed during a so-called ceasefire in Gaza, just to give you a sense of what a ceasefire means as far as Israel and the United States are concerned. At the same time, I don't want to romanticize people or speak for them, but we talk to our colleagues in Gaza. We host them on the Electronic Intifada live stream very often, and we're hoping to do that again this week to have a guest from Gaza. I mean, people can find all our shows and our episodes on YouTube, where we speak to people in Gaza very regularly. And there is that determination to remain. There is that sense that this is our land and they're not going to defeat us. And also, Len, we should mention, of course, because it's a principal front in the resistance now, Lebanon, which has, Hezbollah, the resistance in Lebanon, has been fully back in the fight since February 28th, or since March 2nd or 3rd, basically. And this came after, a so-called ceasefire that had begun in November 2024, and during which, just like with Gaza, Israel continued to bomb Lebanon at will while the resistance held its fire. And that was interpreted as meaning, oh, Hezbollah is so weak, Israel has degraded them, they can't do anything. That turned out to be completely untrue. I mean, people who knew the region well, people who read or watched the Electronic Intifada would know that wasn't true, that the resistance had made a choice for tactical or strategic reasons to withdraw from the fight, for internal political reasons. But when they rejoined the battle in March, they did so with more firepower than ever. And it's the Israelis themselves who are saying that. They're saying we're absolutely shocked with the capabilities that Hezbollah is bringing to the Israeli army across the whole of the north of Israel, and even reaching with some of their missiles as far as southern Israel. Now, that's important in itself, but I think there's a parallel there to Gaza, because there's this idea that is current among, mainstream thinking or in Israel or the US, that the resistance in Gaza was defeated. And that's not the case. The resistance agreed to the so-called ceasefire because Israel's method of war, which we're seeing in Iran now, is they don't fight the resistance. In all our coverage of the war, and we have weekly analysis of all the combat videos that came out of Gaza. We're doing now the same with Lebanon and Iran at the Electronic Intifada. We did it for more than 2 years through the genocide in Gaza. There was not one single video of Israeli soldiers engaging Palestinian fighters. There are many videos of Palestinian fighters blowing up Israeli tanks, booby trapping and setting ambushes for Israeli patrols and so on. Lots of that. But the Israelis could not release in 2 years a single video of their forces engaging Palestinian fighters or going down a tunnel and fighting Palestinians there. There isn't one video of that. What there is instead is what we've all seen night and day, 24/7, is them bombing hospitals, bombing homes, bombing residential buildings, bombing refugee camps, massacring families. That's what they do. That's what they're doing in Lebanon. That's what they're doing in Iran. So the reason the resistance in Gaza agreed to a ceasefire was because it was the only way to try to stop the massacres of families, where Israel was literally massacring 100 people a day up until October 10th. Now it's less. It's 4 or 5 people a day plus the siege. So my sense is that the resistance in Gaza, militarily speaking, is absolutely intact. And if the fighting were to resume there, one-sided fighting, only the Palestinians fight the Israeli army, the Israelis, quote-unquote, fight babies and doctors, I think we would see as fierce resistance as we've ever seen at any time since the genocide. The bottom line is Israel. They were able to destroy and commit genocide, but they could not occupy Gaza while the resistance was fighting them, and they did not defeat that resistance. The resistance only agreed to stop fighting them actively for now. But that could change. And of course, all of this is tied to the regional balance of power, the so-called axis of resistance, which is headed by Iran, includes Hezbollah, includes the Palestinian resistance factions, includes Ansarullah in Yemen, and includes the resistance in Iraq. Now, the caricature is always that Iran is the head of the snake. This is how the enemies put it, and all of these are proxies. That's not the case. They are not proxies. These are indigenous resistance movements, which is why they're so fierce and impossible to defeat, because people are fighting for their own land, for their own families. But nonetheless, Iran plays a key role in supporting them, which is why Iran is the number one enemy and target.
Let's talk a little bit about the situation in Iran and in Israel. It seems that I think it's pretty well understood now that Iran was well prepared to resist the attacks by the United States and Israel, which began on February 28th, and that their will is a lot stronger than people had anticipated. Now, maybe it was intentional. Maybe it was intentional misleading that caused the the powers that wanted this war were intentionally trying to make it seem like this was going to be easy. But clearly, the resistance has been quite effective. They've destroyed U.S. assets in the Gulf, ports, radar systems, even shot down planes. Obviously, we all know about the Strait of Hormuz, which is now basically a toll road. And it's interesting that the U.S. has sanctioned Iran for, I don't know, 30 years, and now it seems like it's sort of turnabout because Iran is now sanctioning the United States and its allies by saying, other people can pass through the Gulf with their commerce, but not you. So it's an interesting situation. Can you tell us and obviously, the resistance, also the ability to harm Israel, is something that there's a lot of censorship. We're not really seeing what's going on there. Anything you can tell us about the situation on the ground in Israel and in the Gulf states?
Yeah, I mean, Iran was very clear to anyone who is listening, particularly since the June war when the US and Israel attacked Iran in June, and after 12 days basically begged Iran for a ceasefire because their air defenses were running out, and Iran agreed. And there were critics in Iran who said we shouldn't have agreed so soon. We didn't deter them enough. We didn't do enough damage to them. And I'm sure those people might be saying, well, you see, because less than a year later they came back and in the same perfidious way under the cover of negotiations and launched a surprise attack, murdering our head of state and massacring schoolgirls, attacking hospitals, doing all the things they do in Gaza and Lebanon. But Iran was very clear, I mean, to anyone who is listening, that if you attack us again, it will not be a limited engagement, no more tit for tat. This will be total war. And it will engulf the region, and it will be very costly. It will be costly to us, but it will be even more costly to you, and we'll be ready. And the Iranians have been clear, they're ready for a long war. They're saying we can go on for at least 6 months, maybe 2 years. They've been preparing, and they have strategic depth. We could hear that. We understood that as just, independent analysts. Did people in the U.S. government military know that? Probably some did. I don't know. Those aren't conversations I have. But certainly some did. There have been reporting that the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff told the president this isn't going to be easy. The intelligence people probably knew, but, they have to cook it now to keep their jobs. Like Tulsi Gabbard, they can no longer go and say, well, this is our assessment. They have to agree with whatever the president says. But it seems that Trump was convinced that, it's just going to be a house of cards. It's going to be like Venezuela, a quick, glorious operation, and in and out, and we're done. And that's not what it's going to be at all. There is now no easy way out for the United States. There is no way out that saves face. The U.S. has already been defeated in this war. And so the question for the United States now is whether to cut its losses and accept defeat now, or to keep escalating and accept a bigger defeat later. Because I don't see any, I'm not necessarily the smartest person about this stuff, but that makes sense to me because Iran is able to escalate in any way that the United States and Israel can escalate. They can destroy Iran's energy infrastructure, but Iran can destroy the whole world's energy infrastructure. And every country is going to feel it. We're already hearing about fuel rationing in Australia and Vietnam, in India, around the world. Here in Jordan, I think the energy minister today was telling people, oh, don't worry, we have 60 days of gas supply. That doesn't get you very far if there's a global outage. So Iran can hit them exactly where it hurts. And think about, this golden goose that was the Gulf. You know, people like Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, who are doing all these corrupt wheeling and dealing in this Gulf states with the sovereign wealth funds, with real estate, with I don't know what. You know, all of this class of people, they what is that based on? It's based on the flow of energy. Well, that might stop. And it's based on the idea that these are fundamentally safe countries to put your investments in. And that's all gone. That's gone, and it's not coming back for a long time. Who's going to put billions into Dubai now, or into Kuwait, or into Qatar? Because, you know, the risks are just too great. We've seen that. So I don't see a way for the United States to get out of this without paying significant costs. The question is, pay high costs now or pay even more catastrophic costs later? But I don't see a leadership in the United States capable of making rational decisions.
We've seen that around the world, is that they believe their own propaganda and they actually believe their own reality. And sometimes reality hits them in the face, and sometimes it takes a little while for that to happen. But I wanted to switch, Ali, a little bit to free speech, which is one of the things we often talk about on this podcast. And back in January of 2025, you were headed to Switzerland for a conference to talk about some of these issues, or the issues of 2025, and you were arrested at the airport. Can you talk a little bit about that? And I know there's been some developments recently. Why would the Swiss arrest you? What was that all about, and what was the charge?
Yeah, well, I actually wasn't arrested at the airport. I was allowed into Switzerland. This was in January 2025. I entered Switzerland. I flew into Zurich, and it was a Friday, and I was supposed to speak at events on Saturday and Sunday about the genocide in Gaza, events that had been organized by activists in Switzerland. And these were not huge events. You know, they weren't something anyone outside those circles would probably have heard about had all this stuff not happened. What happened is that when I was walking on a beautiful, quiet street in Zurich, it was an unseasonably warm January day, with one of my hosts, a lovely Swiss gentleman. We were walking to the venue where we were supposed to do this first event on that Saturday. And I was literally, I mean, it was just the most shocking thing. I was grabbed off the street by four people in plain clothes, literally grabbed. I thought I was being robbed, thrown into an unmarked car and driven away and handcuffed and taken to prison. I mean, it was a kidnapping. It was an abduction. I was held in prison for 3 days, and then I was taken in a cage in handcuffs to the airport and deported. Now, when I was arrested, I mean, I've told this story at length on the Electronic Intifada, so I won't go into that. But basically, I was told that if I spoke in Switzerland, it would be a threat to public order, and that I might incite people to go out and commit crimes against Jewish people. That's what I was told in prison. I was never charged with anything. Eventually, after I was deported, I had a great team of lawyers in Switzerland. We challenged this at every level. We went to the court in the Zurich canton. Switzerland's a federal system, so that would be the equivalent of state court in Zurich. And we challenged my arrest and detention, and we won. It was declared illegal. And the next stage in that is that we are going to claim compensation for the arrest and deprivation of my liberty. And this was an important legal precedent because the court ruled that that what happened to me was a violation of my constitutional rights in Switzerland and my rights under the European Convention of Human Rights. So it has Europe-wide precedential consequences potentially. We went to federal court in Switzerland to challenge the entry ban and expulsion order that were imposed on me after I lawfully entered the country. And just 2 weeks ago, we won in federal court. They ruled for us, and they said that the decisions to ban me from the country and expel me were baseless, that I never represented any threat, and that all my opinions were protected by free speech, by the constitutional right to free speech. And we still have some criminal cases that are pending. And I'm only going to mention one because it's so illustrative. The federal police chief at the time this happened to me, that would be the equivalent, let's say, of the FBI director in the United States, a woman called Nicoletta Della Valle. She is the person who personally signed the illegal order to have me basically arrested, imprisoned, and deported. And there was a parliamentary inquiry that found that she violated all of the country's procedures, and that FedPol, basically like the FBI, had done an investigation. They'd found I was no threat, and they said there's no reason to ban him from the country, and she personally overruled it. It turns out that Nicoletta Della Valle retired very shortly after she signed those illegal orders and was immediately given a very lucrative job by an Israeli private equity fund called Champel Capital that primarily invests in the weapons industry. And so she has very close ties to the state of Israel. So we filed a criminal complaint against her for abuse of office because I would like real transparency to know exactly why she made that decision and what else might have been behind it, given her documented connections to the state of Israel. But the last thing I'll say on this is that what happened to me in Switzerland, as extraordinary as it was for me, is one case among a worldwide wave of repression across the so-called democratic West. Of course, many viewers and listeners will know what has happened in the US under the Trump administration with the arrests and deportations of Palestine activists from colleges. But this is also happening across Europe, where the EU is imposing sanctions on EU citizens, turning them into non-persons within the EU where they can't access their bank accounts, they can't engage in any transactions with people, on the basis that they are engaged in so-called disinformation, which in fact means challenging or doing journalism that challenges official narratives about Russia, Ukraine, and in the first documented case recently of the German journalist Hüseyin Doğru, because he did journalism they don't like about Gaza.
Len, you're on mute.
Sorry. Following up on Pat's question about free speech and independent media, growing up as a liberal Jew in the north side of Chicago, I was always taught about the two-state solution, going back to the 1967 borders, and that's really the goal. I don't know, maybe you could comment on that. I don't know whether that was all a fraud anyway. It seems like maybe it was, that there really was no intention as far as Israelis to live side by side with the Palestinians. But one of the things that struck me in my visits to Israel, and I've been to the West Bank, I've actually been to Jordan. I was once there was like a peace park in Jordan that has borders on the Palestine, Israel, and Jordan, and there was all this great rhetoric about, peace and we're all going to live in harmony. One of the things that struck me about going to Israel is just how Israelis really don't know very much about the West Bank because they're completely cut off. Israelis are not allowed to travel to the West Bank. They don't get to meet Palestinians who live in the West. The only Palestinians they meet are the ones that live in Israel. One of the things that the Electronic Intifada has done, and other media, independent media, I would call it, is sort of bring those people so that we get to know them, which is wonderful about your show. We get to hear the voices from Gaza and from the West Bank. Could you talk a little bit about the situation and is because people assume Israelis know their neighbors better than us, but that's just not true in my limited experience. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, you raised a number of things there. I mean, I think it's important to recall that Israel is a settler colonial society, and the way they view Palestinians is the way settler colonizers always view natives, which, whether we're talking about French settlers in Algeria, whether we're talking about European settlers in North America, is they view the natives as savages, as violent. To a certain extent, there can be a romanticization, the idea of the noble savage or the good Arab. All of these racist tropes are what dominates Israeli views of Palestinians historically. But I would say that increasingly any nuance that existed is gone, and Palestinians are viewed as Amalek, as subhumans to be exterminated. And what is shocking is the extent to which that is a consensus in Israel, that the polls always showed that support for the genocide in Gaza was in the 80s, and when you take so-called right-wing Israelis, sort of center to right, it's in the 90s. And when you go to the left, it's the lowest is in the 70s. So this is a genocidal society, a deeply genocidal society. And that's an important point, because you'll often see liberal politicians in the US who are willing to criticize Israel to a certain extent, say, for example, Bernie Sanders, who limit their criticism to Netanyahu. They say, oh, it's the Netanyahu government. And that's a cop-out. It's not the Netanyahu government. If Netanyahu were to disappear today, there would be no change or improvement. Netanyahu is a reflection. I mean, Israel is actually democratic in the sense that the government truly represents the genocidal views of the people. There was a so-called peace camp in the 1990s that I think sincerely to them embraced the two-state solution. And there was an analog for them in the United States and in Israel, and represented by Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres and so on. But their notion of the two-state solution, certainly when it comes to the Israelis, was of Bantustans, like under the apartheid regime. This is something I examined in detail in my first book, which I can't believe was published 20 years ago this year, One Country, where I examine exactly these questions. What would a so-called two-state solution have actually meant? And it would have meant reservations or Bantustans for Palestinians, dressed up as a state. It wouldn't have meant liberation. It wouldn't have meant sovereignty. It wouldn't have meant self-determination. But the so-called two-state solution was always about managing a native problem. It was never about giving Palestinians their rights. And that's why it couldn't ever be implemented, because when Palestinians approach it, they say, okay, well, we'll accept a state in a fraction of our historic homeland as a major compromise, but we have to have real sovereignty over it. We have to have real independence. We have to really be able to control our destiny, at least in this little state. And Israel was never willing to grant that. So it was always a lie. It was always a ruse. And it served a rhetorical purpose as well, of when you would say throughout the so-called peace process, but Israel is continuing to steal land, to build settlements, to kill Palestinians, to brutalize them, to imprison them, to put children in prison, to subject children to military trials. People would say, oh, well, yes, isn't that terrible? But there's a peace process, and I support the peace process. So it was always this rhetorical tool to escape having to look at the reality as it was and where it was actually heading on the ground. And always to defer that to some kind of mythical future in which people will live side by side in peace. And those things like the peace parks and so on that existed, I probably don't exist now. In any case, you wouldn't be allowed anywhere near the frontier zone now in Jordan. But that never had any real popular base because people understood that a treaty with Israel is not justice. It's not returning land to people. It's not bringing refugees back to the land from which they were ethnically cleansed. There was no reality to it. And I think we've reached the point now where we are in that ultimate confrontation. I don't know if this will be the last battle. That sounds very ominous, and it is really. I mean, we're worrying about things we never worried about before here in Jordan, but there is a fundamental contradiction. Zionism is an exterminationist, genocidal, settler colonial ideology. You cannot live with it. You can no more live with this genocidal entity than you can live with a house fire. You can't be in your house and it's on fire and say, oh, it's fine. You can't. So does that mean there's no possible optimistic future? I don't, but I believe there still is. We've interviewed Ilan Pappé, who would be a wonderful person to have on this show, the Israeli historian in the UK now, who wrote The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. And he says that, the period we're in now, since October 7th, and perhaps the next period will be some of the worst times we've seen. And they are for so many people. But beyond that is the prospect of decolonization, not as academic jargon, but actual decolonization, and a chance for people in this region to actually control their destiny and their future. Iraq finally to be free of U.S. occupation, Palestine to be free, all these countries to be run by their people, not by vassals who answer to Washington, Tel Aviv. That is something to look forward to.
Well, it's always good to end on a hopeful note, Ali. We appreciate everything you do. And again, we're really appreciative of all their fights in Switzerland to establish these precedents, which are so important. Because as you say, it's happening there, it's happening all across Europe, it's happening in the United States. And, for you to stand up against that and actually make legal progress is amazing and is quite a feat that obviously will never be reported in mainstream press. But we salute you for everything you're doing, and including getting information out through Electronic Intifada. Where can people find you?
Well, electronicintifada.net, that's electronic, INTIFADA.net. And we're on, Twitter X, YouTube. People can find our shows there. We have one of the things I'm most proud of is the written reportage and writing from our colleagues in Gaza that we're publishing every day at the Electronic Intifada, electronicintifada.net. Some of the most extraordinary writing you will read anywhere in the world. And it's in English, so it's accessible to people. And so please, if you don't do anything else, please read a piece from one of our writers in Gaza and share it with someone you care about.
Well, amen to that. Thank you, Ali. We feel like there's so many other subjects we'd love to get into with you. We hope you'll come back, and please stay safe there in Jordan.
Thank you. I'd love to.
All
Yeah,
right.
thank you all.